Okay, I get a challenge from a 2100. Let's play him. HB Pencil 1. Alright, let's play HB Pencil 1, 2094. That's a good rating. Okay, so let's play a French. I've been getting some requests to play a French. I'm going to do that. And in the French, there's two main lines. You can play the win hour, bishop b4, attacking the knight on c3, which is defending the pawn. But the move that I prefer to play, the move that I actually have played, is just knight to f6, attacking the pawn. Now white has several moves here. Yeah, so bishop g5 is one of them. Now you take on e4, that's the main line. And basically, you get this very interesting structure where, okay, bishop e7, developing the bishops, cutting into the pin. The main move here is bishop takes f6. Basically, it's the principle here is the same, g takes f6, as in the modern, where we give white better control of the center. But in return, we get several things. This pawn structure is very easy to misunderstand. It looks bad, but remember what I always say, when we have several pawns massed together in the center, that can actually be a good thing. We have f5 in our pocket, but we don't want to play f5 yet. We want to find a good place for this bishop. I'll explain everything after the game. We could take with the bishop, that's also possible. Where should this bishop go? And definitely not to d7, that just seems really awkward. Yeah, we should definitely fianchetto the bishop, this is a perfect place to do it. Then, at some point, we're going to go f5. Our bottom line idea here with black is to put pressure on the d-pawn. We can actually do that by castling long, where we probably will castle long. Because castling short here, it's not that it's unthinkable, it's actually possible in certain positions, but when we can castle long, we definitely should. Okay. Yeah, f5 would weaken e5. We should definitely factor that into our calculus here. Now, so what kind of moves can we play here? What should we do? How should we go about playing this? So there's a move that we can make that is not a developing move per se. Yeah, so knight c6 is possible, but we have to be very careful about a central strike like d5. The first thing we're going to do here, nobody has suggested this move yet. Look at the g file for a second. I am a big fan of developing flexibly, so not revealing entirely what I want to do yet, and a way of doing that would be rook g8. Let's actually make sure that white castles, and if white castles, then it's, I would say, easier for us to develop in a way that would be more conducive to attacking on the king side. If white goes g3, well, then he weakens the long diagonal, and then I'm going to show you guys the best way of developing here. It's going to blow people's mind. But there is actually a logic to it. The best move, the best way that I've learned to develop my pieces here, is actually to play c6. I'm going to play this move now, and I'm going to explain it after the game. But basically, the idea is this. If you were to go knight d7, what would you allow? What move would be very nasty in that position? Yeah, I know c6 looks terrible. But if we go knight d7, we allow him to break through with d5. That is not pleasant at all. So c6 temporarily stops him from going d5. Now we can go knight d7, and we've opened up a little window for the queen on c7. Now I know what you guys are thinking. Like, aren't we blocking the bishop? Like, doesn't that violate the most basic rule? It does, but this is a dynamic factor, because at the end of the day, we are probably going to play c5 and unlock that bishop once again. This is a temporary measure that we're taking to prevent d5 until we are ready to reopen the board with c5. There's nothing... So, in other words, the bishop has a lot of potential energy. Now, he's attacking the pawn. What would be a good way to defend against that pawn? And I've mentioned this move before. Yeah, the move is f5. Notice that the knight on d7 also guards the e5 square, so he can't put a knight there. We can also improve the position of our dark-squared bishop by putting it on the long diagonal and basically fulfilling our ultimate goal, which is to attack d4. Let's actually do that. Bishop a6 here is possible, but it's not that scary. And against bishop a6, we have a really interesting idea. Now let's take a look at this knight for a second very carefully. If we go c5 here, he can still go d5. This knight on d7 is sort of stumbling in our way. And there is a way that we can improve that knight. It's a particular type of maneuver. It's not knight b8, the knight would be super passive. Well, the knight is bad because it's sort of blocking the rook. The move is actually b5. And we pave the way for the knight to come to b6. And potentially we can push the pawn with b4. And that could be very unpleasant. Now, aren't we weakening our king? Well, we are. But as I've said many times, what you need to understand here is that white doesn't have the firepower necessary to really exploit this weakness. Look at how many pieces are next to our king. It's really not a problem. It's not something that you should be worried about when you understand how many pieces there are next to the king and the fact that white really can't attack. Okay, that he just made a big mistake. He missed a particular move. What did he miss? The opening was a French. Gaga, gaga. So rook g4 is creative, but let's take a look at this knight for a second. This knight actually has no squares. So we can trap the knight with b4. This literally just traps the knight. And when I played b5, the way that I saw this is I sort of noticed that b4 was a general possibility. And so that means you have to test it at least for a couple seconds on every move. This wins the knight. That is a nice little French game here. And yeah, he's busted here. He is busted. Knight e4, we take it. He's given up the knight for what he can. Now he's attacking this pawn. Let's go h5 and defend it. We also create a stronghold for the rook on g4. We can involve the rook that way. And the rook will be able to attack the d4 pawn. Although that's not necessarily mandatory, we can also just double the rooks, which I kind of prefer. I kind of prefer the idea of doubling the rooks, playing more centrally. And the rook from d5, okay, so what do we do here? That was a mistake. We need to be very attentive to how the position has changed. So he's getting his knight to b3. We need to stop him from doing that. And if we are attentive, well, rook g4 is not necessary. We can just straight away take. I think he's watching my stream. He just said rook takes d4. No, you're definitely not stupid for struggling to get 800. That is far from easy. Okay, and we just trade rooks. Actually, if we want to be fancy here, oh, we have a sexy winning move here. Now, what am I noticing here? I've said many times, what is the worst defender of any other piece? The queen. The queen is the worst defender of any other piece. Queen is defending the rook. Queens are very easy to distract. And we distract the queen by going queen e5. If he takes the queen, and we first take the rook with check, he covers it with his knight, and then we take his queen. If he doesn't, we are also threatening checkmate. He's busted immediately. If he gives us a distraction check on 8-5, we can just move the king, actually. So that was a nice game. So that was kind of complex. This is why I don't recommend the French to certain players. I feel like, there's a lot of new structural things that you have to understand about it in order to play it effectively, and that's just not always easy to do on demand. Now, knight c3 is the main line. Knight f6 is the Steinitz variation, or the classical variation. Bishop b4 is the Winauer, which is the most popular move. This is fine. Like, this is a decent move. This is the main move. But the way I learned it is with knight f6. Now, e5 is the main move, along with bishop g5. And basically, this creates a pawn chain. The idea of going knight f6 is that the knight is on c3. It's blocking the move c3, which means that c5 is going to be particularly strong, undermining the base of the pawn chain. And the main line continues f4, protecting it from the other side. And basically, the battle, much like in the advanced French, revolves around whether we're going to be able to get to that pawn on d4. This should make sense to you guys. Hey, good game. Thanks for being in the stream. That was great. So he plays bishop g5. How do you deal with queen g4? I'm not sure in which position. Well, if they push g5 right away, that's called the advanced French. That is what I have played with white, and c5, c3, knight c6. It's like the same type of position. Our moves are going to be geared toward trying to get rid of that d4 pawn to make white's pawn chain collapse. That's really all there is to it. There's a lot of theory there. Okay? Now, f6 would be a thematic mistake. These moves are possible in the French, but we're attacking the tip of the pawn chain. And normally, as we know, we want to attack the base of the pawn chain. That's just like the main thing you want to do. Okay? I hope that makes sense. All right. Looks like it does make sense. I don't want to bog ourselves down too much with the opening theory. So takes, bishop e7. Bishop takes f6. Now, why didn't I take bishop takes f6? So, like, the reason, this is a move, but g takes f6 has a lot of these hidden benefits. Like, we get the g file open for ourselves, and we can potentially play f5 and pave the way for the bishop to come to f6. If we play bishop takes f6, then he can first of all take the bishop and really simplify the position. We don't necessarily want that. We actually keep the two bishop advantage by taking the pawn. So there are these complicating factors, and The fact that the pawn structure is kind of weak is, yes, that's a detriment to this, but it's not the only disadvantage. So knight f3, b6, right? Bishop d7 is super passive, and it allows this very, very nasty pawn breakthrough. So we want to prevent that. Bishop b7, rook g8, forcing him to weaken his position or reveal the fact that he castles. I think rook g1 is inaccurate. I do think white should castle. Even though later on, I mean, we can use the fact that I'm pressuring g2. I do think that's the best. This is absolutely, I've played this over the board. This is a main line. I think in classical games, bishop e2 is considered inaccurate. There's other ways of playing this. For example, g3 here is a good move. And the idea is to deploy the bishop to the long diagonal. If black does the same, what does white have in this position? Yeah, if he takes with the knight, then we take with the bishop. Yeah. Sorry, I had to get a bite of chocolate. That's the thing. And there's a lot of theory here. So rook g8, rook g1, c6. Now this is the key move. I want people to... So somebody asked, can't white play d5 anyway? Well, no, he can't, because we just take it. We've got 2 defenders on the pawn and 2 attackers, which means he cannot take. Yeah, we can play bishop a6, but the bishop is actually a good piece. We don't actually want to trade it, even though we can. So rook g8, rook g1, c6. Now, I explained the logic during the game, but just to recap. Fact 1, we need to develop the knight. That should not be a surprise to anybody. We need to develop the knight. We need to complete our development. We also have to castle at some point. We can't keep our king in the center forever. He's ultimately going to go d5. And we have 3 ways of developing the knight, and all 3 of them allow d5. Knight c6 allows d5 because it obstructs the bishop. And I wanted to make sense to everybody why allowing d5 is nasty. The reason allowing d5 is nasty is because we have a deficient pawn structure, which means our king is weaker, which means we don't want to let him open up the center just yet until at least until we castle. So knight c6 allows d5. Knight d7 also allows d5 because it obstructs the queen. And, you know, in contrast to the other position, we can't take white's queen. This is very, very bad for us. So that's as I explained. What makes it so good for white? Because the fact of the matter is our pawn structure near our king is worse than white's. So when he opens up the center, he exploits and he sort of magnifies the problems created in our pawn structure. That's why we want to keep the center closed. Yes, you can go e5. But now white's carved out some weak squares. White can go here and then here. We've created a very big weakness on the f5 square. We've also blunted the bishop. White can also go here, right, and put a bishop on f5. Creates outposts for his pieces. We don't really want to do that. A c6, you guys will see, is a very thematic move in the French. In these positions, I can show you many games where this move has been played. Queen d2, knight d7. The other benefit of c6 is that we find nice ways to develop our knight and queen. Thank you, Juskuz. Right, we go queen c7. Our queen isn't in the way. King b1 castle. And now we're basically ready to play c5. We don't actually have to rush with this move. And we didn't in the game. But we are ready to play this should the occasion present itself. So c5 here would be already something we could think about. Because here I would notice that the rook x-rays the queen, which means we could move the knight out of the way. The pawn would be in trouble. I'm not saying this is like the best thing we could do. Black could continue to prepare c5. Black could also do b5 and knight b6. And that also is the idea we applied in the game. Also very typical. So that would also be a possibility. Well, e5 here would not open the bishop, so he could ignore this. And also, I remind you that this creates a weakness on the f5 square, which is not the end of the world, but we don't necessarily just want to create weaknesses for free. Thank you, Kryptonite64, for the prime. Okay? So I've studied these positions, so I kind of know these ideas. So f5. f5 would be perfectly good. Bishop f6, improving the bishop. Here, for example, c5 would allow d5 again. And we can't take because the bishop hangs. And also he's moved the queen away from the pin, away from the x-ray of the rook. So bishop a6 is fine. Now we go b5. Thank you, b-go 97. Appreciate the prime. And the idea behind b5 is to improve the positioning of our knight and to begin the attack against his king. Why is the knight bad on d7? Because it blocks the rook. And because on b6, it can potentially jump to c4, which is a really, really nice square. So g3, knight b6, and now the decisive mistake, blundering the knight. What should white have done here? several possible moves. Maybe rook d3. And then vacate the d1 square. Not ideal, but at least this doesn't lose the knight. You could also go a3, but that would create a hook. And that would create a hook which we could exploit by going a5, b4. That would not be my favorite move. I think white is slightly worse here. I don't like white's position particularly, but you could also go queen e3 and open up the e2 square for the knight, although knight c4 now is possible. So you guys can see how unpleasant things have become here. I think that white made a series of inaccuracies that led to a nasty position. So that would be my suggestion. G3, knight b6, rook e1, b4, winning the knight, h5 defending the pawn, doubling rooks, just taking the pawn. And now the simple queen e5 wins the game because we're threatening checkmate, we're threatening the queen, and if he takes, rook takes d1 as an intermediate move. We take the queen, we're up, or rook and a knight. So, you know, that's why these structures are unique. Like it's not impossible to understand the motivations behind a move like this, but it's hard to find this if you've never seen this move before. It's very unintuitive to close down your bishop like this with the foreknowledge that ultimately you're going to open it back up again. The other thing, and I've made this point many times, but at this higher level, it's okay to have one of your pieces be passive for a certain period of time. Because black has such a solid central pawn structure, you don't actually need this bishop to be super active yet. That's not a necessity. White's pieces aren't that active either. Like white's bishop isn't that active, white rook is passive, the knight on c3 isn't doing much. So it's okay even for 10, 15 moves for your bishop on b7 to be not the strongest piece in the world. That comes back to a point I've always made, which is that not every one of your pieces has to be curing COVID or distributing the vaccine at any given moment. It's okay for a piece to be doing something like working inside of the machine, you know, getting the machinery to run from inside of an office building rather than from, you know, a place where everybody can tell that it's good, if that makes sense. Well, c6, let's see if the computer likes it. Yeah, so c6 is not necessarily the best according to the computer, but I think it's quite decent. I actually think if we let the computer think here, it'll appreciate c6. And yeah, it's very complex. Like at this level, you need to find ideas like these to make stuff work. But the logic isn't unrealistic. I've explained every step of the logic, but it's just hard to get yourself to play this. That's just the reality of chess at like a 2300 level. Your pieces are cramped, you're not attacking anything directly, but that's temporary. Right? That is entirely temporary. Eventually, once I open stuff up, his position is going to collapse really fast. It's one of those lines where you do stuff for a long time, you're not attacking anything, but then when the position actually opens up, you know, you make everything up. You all of a sudden your pieces become really active. Hey, Gary. The computer actually, at a very low depth, it says knight c6. I'm not sure why it's not worried about this. Oh, it's saying knight b4. Okay. This was interesting, actually. Couldn't white have exploited the fact that I'm undeveloped in the case? Well, white is not developed either. White is not developed either. So it's not like if white had a queen here and white had a rook here, yeah, that would be different. But I'm developing very fast to castle queenside, so white just doesn't have the power to exploit that, if that makes sense. This is also theory. Like, it's theory, and I know that, and so I know that this is legitimate, right? Even if white had a rook on g7, it would not be easy to do anything. It's very hard to give checkmate in general. Let's play dm85. And let's go d4. So it's time for us to branch out a little bit. I'm going to play the Jaba London, which I play at my own level. And I'm going to give you guys a little run through as to the main ideas of this opening. I know that... Whoa, Gary 500ing. Thanks, Gary. Okay, now... Basically, we're just developing pieces. Now we go e3. We support the d4 pawn. We do not take on c5, and I'll explain why after the game. And this is already a mistake. This is already a very big mistake. That is one of the appeals of playing the Jababa. You guys can see that good players fall into this trap. Knight b5, and there's no good defense against knight c7. There is no good defense against knight c7. Short of moving the king out, which is probably the best move, honestly, but pretty disastrous on its own. And e5 here intercepts the bishop, but it drops the pawn. I've shown this line before. And I would caution people, that is the reason I haven't played this before. I would caution people to do this stuff solely for the sake of getting your opponent to fall into traps. And he actually plays this the best way. Now, a6 attacks our knight, counterattacks our knight. Now, the reason that we don't want to play e takes f6, if we calculate here, ef6, a b5, and then if we play bishop b5, we fall into queen a5 check, which wins the bishop. Now, knight d6 check, he would take on d6, and then the pawn on d6 that would result would be weak. So what is the simplest move here? We don't have to overthink it. Just play it simple. The pawn on d5 is weak. So if we operate from that perspective, we can just go knight back to c3. We're now attacking his knight. If he moves his knight, he drops the d5 pawn. He's going to be 2 pawns down. Although, it's not as simple as that, because we need to watch our own position. d4. Okay, now, let me think about, do we want to play ed first? No, we don't. Let's just take his queen. Now, what would be the simplest move here? And we don't want to rush. We need to develop a tempo. Very, very typical way. Yeah, developing with tempo. Castle long, check. And now we are going to be up a full healthy pawn in the endgame. Let's take here. Now, the reason we didn't play FG is because that would help him develop, right? We don't want to help our opponent develop his pieces. Now we have a simple endgame. We are a pawn up, but we need to be very precise. This is not going to be easy to win, especially against a very strong opponent like dm85. Now, how should we go about developing here? Who can propose a move here? Basically, like, what we need to realize here, we need to do a couple of things. We need to figure out, okay, where does our opponent want to put his pieces? And this bishop on c8, he wants to get it to e6 and target the a2 pawn. So let's start with a move bishop c4. But if he goes bishop e6, there's a 5-head move that we can play. He probably is going to go bishop e6. Now, we don't want to take his bishop. Because that would help him correct his pawn structure. If we play bishop b3, we got our bishop trapped. But we can go bishop d5. And if he attacks the bishop, we can support it by pushing one of these pawns. If he takes on d5, we get our rook to a really, really nice central location. So bishop b3 is the right idea, but the wrong execution. Rook g8, no problem. So he's attacking this pawn. We can just defend it. We can go g3. It's an awkward looking move, but remember that he can't attack this bishop. So the fact that this bishop is sort of trapped is not a bad thing. There's no way to attack it. And in fact, the bishop is now very well protected. There's something that looks wrong with this move, but there actually isn't anything as far as I know. Rook d8. So we can play c4 or we can play e4. Both moves have a case that can be made for them. I do like c4. The potential issue with... Actually, no, I do like c4. Actually, I do like c4. Well, there actually is an issue with c4, and I did miss a move here. But that's okay. I think we have a response to that move. The problem with this move is I did not actually practice what I preach. I didn't understand which squares this move leaves behind. Let's see if he... Well, b5 I thought about, but he drops the knight. That I did think about. We should have gone e4, though. e4 was better. Yeah, he finds knight b4. So he attacks the bishop. Now let's prioritize here. If we move the bishop, then he plays knight takes a2 check, disattaching the king from the rook. So it's a lot more important to preserve the bishop than to defend this pawn, which means we should go e4. Yes, we give up the pawn, but that's okay, because we still have a monster bishop. He's playing extremely well. Now we should develop our knight and connect our rook, so we don't have to worry about this stuff anymore. Now we potentially are threatening to take on b7, although f5 would be a super, super strong move here. Let's see if he finds it. Oh, but then we can maybe still take on b7. f5, we can actually take on b7. That gets a little complicated, but his king is weaker than ours, so I think that should pay off in the end. Yeah, that was an inaccuracy by me, but, I make these mistakes all the time. It's okay. I should have gone e4 first, and the pawn on c3 would have guarded b4. That's why it's so important at this level to, whenever you move a pawn, you allocate 3-4 seconds, 3-4-5 seconds to understanding, okay, what squares am I leaving behind? Can he occupy those squares? Flyer 10, hello. Now we need a plan. There is a very typical plan in such positions, right? We have a file on which most of the action is happening. That's the D file. So logically speaking, what can we do to emphasize our control over the file? Yeah, knight c3 is good as well. We can improve the knight. But let's double the rooks. Double the rooks. That should be a plan. That's not surprising to anyone. That is the classic way of exploiting our control over a file. Here's how you should... Okay, so knight e5. Should we take the knight? Should we take the knight? And don't say no just because I'm... Yeah, we should. I got you guys. I know a lot of people will say no because on like tests and stuff... Yeah, why not? We take the knight. Look at how lame his bishop is, just staring at all these pawns. Look how lame his bishop is. Now we get to double. We win a tempo. Guess what? That's as good as it gets, ladies and gentlemen. That's as good as it gets. And goes bishop e7. I baited you guys. Now we can play several different types of moves. This knight on e2. Let's improve the knight. Let's get the knight to a civilized square. Potentially, we can get it to d5, but let's not rush, because if we take the bishop on e6, why is it well, bishop e7, he's got rook b8 winning the bishop. So let's prepare bishop takes b7. Actually, let's go h4 first. Let's expand a little bit on the king side. Let's deprive the bishop of the g5 square, and we are preparing a particular move here. Yeah, we want to move the king. I want to move it to c1, but if I moved it to c1 immediately, he would have this check that would send me right back. So we go h4 to take away the g5 square from the bishop in preparation for king c1. Now, a lot of you might be asking, well, why the hell didn't we just move the king to the a file? Well, it wasn't that easy. I didn't want to move the king to the a file because it's an endgame. And in endgames, you know, it's not a great idea to move the king away from the center. And I want to keep the king relevant. That's basically the bottom line. Now we're kind of threatening bishop takes b7, although it really depends on what he does. Yeah, we want to make sure our king is active. In fact, we can bring the king all the way to e3. That might be a good idea if he does find a way to defend the pawn. Yeah, there's a lot going on here. I'm not explaining everything, but I think you guys are getting the gist of what I'm doing. White is better here. It's a very hard position to play. Okay, so bishop g4. I know what all of you guys are thinking. We should play f3, but this is actually a really clever move. If we go f3, he drops his bishop back to c8. And guess what happens? The pawn on g3 becomes extremely weak. And his rook attacks. And then if we go g4, he wins the pawn on h4. So let's just move our rook up. Let's not make any reactionary moves. These are moves that a lot of people struggle with. A move like rook d2 is not an intuitive move, right? When we can block it with tempo. But you got to learn how to make these kinds of moves. Yeah, so he goes bishop c8 anyway. He defends the pawn. Now we need to scour the position for other weaknesses. Okay, what else can we attack here? What else can we attack here? We can go knight a4 and attack this pawn. Absolutely, let's tickle him. He's low on time, so it's a good idea to create more threats. And if he plays b6, okay, so he moves the rook away. Okay. Does he create any threats? No. Where can this knight potentially go? Where can this knight potentially... Where do we want this knight? How do we prepare? Remember, the rooks have done their job. So we go rook b3 to prepare to sink that knight into b6. What does that accomplish? Well, that gets the bishop. Ooh, and there comes the panic. Okay, we applied a lot of pressure, there comes the blunder. Now we give a check. And now what do we do? Now that the bishop has gone from e7, what do? Who can tell me the move? We actually just take the pawn, yeah. Well, it's not that it's a meltdown. He was under tremendous pressure for most of the game. Now we can just shift the rook back to b7 and pressure the bishop. If the bishop moves away, then we take f7. So we take f7, we're 3 pawns up. We take g6. And here, we have an intermediate move. Who can tell me the intermediate move? Well, we go here. I have to move. Now, what we want to do here is we want to get the rook out of b7. So we give a check. Now we give another check. We take the rook. We move away from the check. We can go here, and we win the game. Okay, because if his king moves, then we take the bishop. So if we took the bishop immediately, I'm trying to be accurate until the end, we give up the rook. That was a really nice game, and it was very well played by DM. Thank you. Thank you for the game. Let's unpack what happened here. Now, this is the Jaba London. The reason it's called that is, as I've explained before, it has sort of roots from, well, Bahadur Jababa, Georgian GM, really popularized this in the last couple of years. This has been around for a very long time. It was first played in 1882 by James Mason, who was one of the strongest players he was Irish, actually, but he was definitely top 20 in the world in the 19th century. So James Mason actually played this in 1882. Alekhine was the 4th person to play this. Alekhine played it twice. That's how good these people were. And then it really was only played a handful of times until the 80s. Then in the 80s, people started playing it. In the 90s, people played it. And then really in the last 10 years, Badur Jabava really started playing it regularly. I picked it up about 5 years ago. I thought it was a good way to avoid theory. It's a very venomous opening. Very venomous. Now, the reason that it is frowned upon. What is the reason that the move knight c3 is frowned upon in general? This is called the Veresov. The traditional Veresov is to put the bishop on g5. But why is this like not considered to be mainstream? Yeah, because it blocks the c-pawn. And as you guys know in the queen's pawn openings, the move c4 is like very commonplace. That's the main line. So when you block the c-pawn, you have no way of contesting black's control over the center. But I think it's better than the Veresov. Now, essentially part of the idea of playing the Jababa is that white actually can play oftentimes on the king's side. And ideas like playing g4 are very common here. So bishop f5, f3 is one of the main lines. And white literally wants to play g4 and h4. Jababa himself often pops into the stream. So like g4 and h4 is oftentimes a very, very typical idea. I've played like this. And white basically plays this like a Caro-Kann. White just attacks the king side. Very modern chess, right? People wouldn't do this 100 years ago because this looks outrageous. How could you move your pawns here? What are you doing? Well, white can castle the other side, and white can even keep his king in the center. White can even park the king on f2, which is a surprisingly safe square. And to show you guys like a good example of how I applied this stuff, I'll run through very quickly one of my games in the Jababa where I applied this idea. And I'll show you why it's not that easy for black to really exploit the weakness of the king. It's you know, this doesn't tell the whole story. So here's a good game of mine. Now, Seductive Orange, looks like I guilted enough people. We do have to get to 5,700. We're 2 away. That we have to do. So basically, as you guys can see, here's f3, g4, and h4. That is what I just showed you guys. And what happens is, I don't actually castle Gigahertz gifting to the Raven Try. Thank you. But basically, yeah, there we go. King f2. And Lemelak with a tier 1. Thank you. Now, here's the rub here. The king may look very weak, but it's actually very hard to get to it. It is true that I have pushed out my pawns to g4 and h4, but that doesn't mean the king is easy to attack. That's hard for me to sort of explain at a granular level, but I hope this makes sense. And what happens in this game is that I actually checkmate him on the queen side. I get my pieces to the open g-file, and I just attack him. My king remains very safe the entire game. Rook c8, penetrating. King takes g3. It eventually moves to g3. Thank you, 5 minutes dead. And the game ends when I basically just checkmate him. Knight takes d5 ends the game because if he takes, then queen takes e8. And the king actually participates as an attacker. Rook f3, king g4 would win the king. His queen is also hanging. So that was a nice game. That's there's more to analyze here. I've played the Jababa many, many times. Whoa! Holy smokes, Phineas Gage 7-5 gifted to the community. My man. Amazing. Thank you, Phineas, for gifting to Friendly Mayhem, Light, OPSB, Clayton Sororex, and Paul R. Hansen, CTRO. Gets that 3 a.m. hype going. Love it. Thank you for the 5 gifted, sir. Yeah, it'll be hard to play for lower rated people because it involves, like, not because I'm trying to condescend to anybody, it just involves knowing when to violate these principles, right? Things like king safety, you don't want to mess around with. That's playing with fire. So the Jababa is a very dangerous opening to play. I always compare this, and have since the start of the speedrun, like, think of driving a bus, right? You haven't learned how to drive a car, and you sit down behind a bus, and now you're trying to navigate the city streets, right? You need to master the mechanics fully before you attempt something relatively crazy. And even I crash that bus sometimes. I've lost some painful games of Jababa. Okay, now let's go back to the game. Basically, he goes c5, which is one of the main lines, and knight c6 is a very typical mistake. So a6 here, either before or after c takes d4, e takes d4, is the main line. a6 stops knight b5. And in this position, you can go either knight c6, or you can go bishop g4, immediately pin the knight, and increase the pressure on the d4 pawn. This is one of the main lines of the Jababa. Black has a fine position here. It's, there's a lot of theory here. I've played several games in this line. Oh, knight c6 is a mistake, knight b5. And now look at what happens. He cannot stop knight c7, literally. King to d7 here is very bad because of bishop c7. And a position like this is just absolute disaster. Look at his king. Knight e5 check is coming. Knight e5 check is coming. That's going to be absolutely devastating. So, yeah, this is horrible. A6 is not wasting time. A6 stops knight b5 and potentially prepares b5. So you got to do what you got to do in chess. Okay, so e5d takes e5 a6. And now, if knight e4, I've showed this before. What is white's best move here? And what follow-up tactic does white have here? Good job by my opponent not missing this. Oftentimes people tilt into missing this. Yeah, queen d5. Queen d5, knight c7. And you pick off the queen. You're 2 pawns up. The king is lost its castling rights. Black is completely lost. So that's a nice little follow-up. a6, knight c3. And now d4. A very good move. Because now if he moves the knight, we can just take on d5 with the knight. So d4 takes, king d8, castling with check, and now b takes c3. And the thing is, f takes g7, bishop g7 helps him develop his bishop. You want to be careful about not moving your opponent's pieces for him, right? By doing this, we both ruin our pawn structure respectively, but that's okay, because I'm the one who's up a pawn. This is not going to be easy to win, though, at all. Why did he take your queen with his king instead of his knight? That's a good question. I think he should have probably taken with the knight. I think because it's an endgame, that would probably not have substantively changed the evaluation, because now he has to waste a tempo improving the position of his knight. And that, in effect, is similar to him moving his king. In fact, the end result of this will be exactly the same if he plays knight c6. That literally transposes to the position from the game. That literally transposes to the position from the game, okay? So bishop c4, stopping him from going bishop e6. He goes bishop e6 anyway, and now bishop d5, one of the key moves in this game. So bishop takes c6 would be bad, although it would trade pieces, which is good. What's bad about this is it corrects his pawn structure, and there's no need to do that unprovoked. Bishop b3 is the typical move in such positions, but it allows him to trap the bishop. So concretely, it just doesn't work. And that's why we played bishop d5, centralizing the bishop. Now we go g3 to defend the pawn. Trade on your own terms. And now c4 is the inaccuracy that I mentioned. e4 was better, because his knight is totally limited by the pawn. My good friend Robert Hess, he talks about this all the time. When the pawn is 3 squares away, or depending on how you look at it, 2 squares, let's say, in between the pawn and the knight, and they're on the same file, the pawn often restricts the knight. You guys can see that the pawn on c3, bad as it appears, is actually completely restricting the knight from either jumping into the center or jumping onto the queen side. I actually didn't fully appreciate that, and pushing the pawn to c4 opens up the possibility for knight b4. Not a good move. But we did damage control successfully here. e4, supporting the bishop. Okay, he wins the pawn back. White is still better. I've got this huge outpost. If he ever takes, then the piece is replaced by an equally strong pawn, and his knight gets in trouble. Doesn't have any ways back. So knight c6, rook d3, doubling the rooks, taking on e5. Why did we want to trade knights? Because there's no reason not to, right? There's absolutely no reason not to. I think Master C, I think that exists on my YouTube channel. If you go into playlists, I think that actually does exist. My editor has been working very hard to ensure that that happens. So you should check it out. If not, I will make sure that that is done. But I'm pretty sure that that actually already exists. One second. Because the knight is active, and the knight is the actual tool that he can use to attack the c4 pawn. Like, the c4 pawn is weak. By taking on e5, we remove the load on that pawn. The other thing is you could easily have a situation where you have a very bad bishop for a good knight. So bishop takes d5, we could choose between taking with the pawn, which a case could be made for. That's a passed pawn. But I would definitely take with the knight here. Look at how monstrous this knight is. Look at how bad this bishop is, staring at a bunch of its pawns of its own color. That's the other reason we want to trade. Thank you, Nathan Oraz, for the prime. Take that horsey off the board, h4. Hopefully the logic behind this move makes sense. To remind you guys, we want to go king c1. Why do we want to go king c1? Because we do want to take this pawn, but we cannot take it because he pins the bishop and wins it. So we need to move the king. We can move it to the a file, but then we withdraw it further away from the center. We don't want that. And we want to go king c1 for it to be closer to the center. We can't do that because of bishop g5 check. that sends the king right back where it came from. So h4 covers the g5 square. Now we go king c1. Bishop g4, rook d2, right? Not playing f3. Just got to be in general careful when you push pawns, particularly in the endgame, because you create weaknesses. No need to create that weakness. We go rook d2. Bishop c8, knight a4, pressuring the pawn on c5. Now we go rook b3, preparing potentially to move knight b6. Now we're not threatening knight b6 immediately because he's got two rooks covering that, but we're accumulating the pressure. And we're also, by the way, attacking the pawn, which I don't see a good way for him to defend. If he went b6, defending the pawn, who could propose a plan? What would we do in this position? Like, what specifically would be a good plan here for white? And this is actually not easy to play. Yeah, nice. So one good plan would be to bring the king to e1. And what this does is it takes away the task of defending the f-pawn from the rook, which means that now we can bring the rook to the b-file. Guess what? We are attacking b6. Now we're attacking b6. Now it is true he can defend with bishop d8, but I want to show like some of the key ideas. Now, maybe we decide, okay, the knight has done its job. Let's bring the knight to c3. We can even play bishop a8, because that bishop is pretty unassailable, and the bishop could be replaced with the knight. So in such positions, what you want to remember is to play very slowly. It's important not to rush, and you want to poke and prod. Poking and prodding is the key to winning these positions. You can't win it in one fell swoop. It's not easy, but when you poke and prod, ultimately your opponent is very likely to make a blunder, just because that's how it is. And that's what happened here. He went low on time. b5, yeah, not the less, Flyerton. Thank you, Heatley31. He blunders the pawn. Our rook gets in. We win the other pawn. Rook b7. We win the third pawn. And now a simple intermediate move, right? If we take here, he takes here. We're still winning, but no need to do that. We give a check and another check, saving the rook. And now we win the rook. And now we win the bishop. And he lost on time, but the game is over anyway. So does that all make sense, guys? Does everything I did here make perfect sense? We put the pressure on. My only real serious mistake, I think, was the move c4. I think that wasn't practicing what I preach. It opened up the b4 square, but we prioritized correctly and we managed to push him off the board eventually.